All right, so you've given us some really fascinating stuff about death anxiety, articles, definitions, even a bit of philosophy in there.
Yeah, it's a pretty big topic.
It is. So let's dive right into this deep dive and explore thanatophobia, the fear of death.
Well, it's not just like being a little afraid, is it? Thanatophobia is a real, true phobia where the fear of death, it's so intense, it actually starts messing with your everyday life, you know?
So it's not just like jumping at a jump scare. It's more than that.
Exactly. Like think about a phobia of spiders or heights. But in this case, it's the idea of death itself or even the process of dying. And just like those other phobias, it can really have a serious impact on how you actually live your life.
So how is thanatophobia different than, say, like being afraid of, I don't know, dead things?
That's a really good question because being afraid of dead things, that's actually its own separate phobia. It's called necrophobia. Thanatophobia, that comes from, the Greek words thanatos for death and phobos meaning fear. It's about the actual concept of death, not just like the physical signs.
Makes sense. So like it's the Grim Reaper, not just a skeleton.
You got it. Now, psychologist Robert Langs, he identified 3 different flavors of death anxiety: predatory, predation, and existential. And each of those digs into a totally different side of this whole fear thing.
3 types. Okay, now we're talking. So let's start with predatory death anxiety. What is that?
Okay, so picture the most basic part of your brain, right? That primal instinct just to survive. Predatory death anxiety, that's that really deep-seated fear of being harmed. Fight or flight kicking in. It's all about self-preservation at its very core.
So that same kind of fear that makes a gazelle run from a lion.
Yeah. Even single-celled organisms, like the very first forms of life, they developed ways to sense danger and escape from it. So this fear, it's literally woven into our DNA. It's ancient.
Wow, that really puts things in perspective. Okay, so let's move on to predation death anxiety. How's that different?
Okay, so this one's interesting. This one comes from the act of harming others, physically or even mentally. It's about guilt, oftentimes subconscious guilt, about the harm that we could potentially inflict.
Okay, so less about something bad is going to happen to me and more about I did a bad thing, so.
Exactly. It can even link back to Freudian theory, actually, about repressed impulses. It suggests that we're aware deep down of our own capacity for good and bad, and that awareness, that can bubble up as anxiety.
Like our conscience trying to deal with the fact that we're mortal. Okay, so we've got the fear of harm, the guilt of causing harm. What's that third one?
All right, so the big one, existential death anxiety. This is the anxiety that comes from just simply knowing that one day we are not going to be here.
The fear of the inevitable. No wonder people lose sleep over that.
Right. And it's one of the things that truly makes us human. We have language, we have a self-awareness, we can think about the future. And as much as those things make us us, they also make us really, really aware of our own mortality.
Our biggest strengths kind of lead to our biggest fears, in a way. It's strange.
It's a paradox. And it's something that's like philosophers and psychologists have been fascinated by forever.
Speaking of, what do the big thinkers have to say about thanatophobia? You've got a bunch of theories to unpack here.
Oh, we do. Each of them gives us a different lens to look at this super complex phobia. Let's start with Freud. He believed that the fear of death, it was often masking other stuff, deeper issues, unresolved stuff from childhood. He actually argued it's not death itself that we fear, it's what it represents.
Childhood stuff never really goes away. It just comes out in different ways, I guess.
Right. And then there's Erik Erikson. He was a developmental psychologist. He saw death anxiety through the lens of his psychosocial theory. And he believed that as we age, we're striving for what he called ego integrity, a sense of fulfillment and acceptance about our lives. And people who reach that, they tend to have less death anxiety.
Which makes sense, right? Like, if you feel good about how you've lived your life, you're probably a little less scared to face the end of it. But what about those who don't reach that acceptance?
Erikson called that despair, and it's often filled with regret, bitterness, and yeah, for sure, a heightened sense of death anxiety. It's that feeling of time's running out, I haven't done what I wanted to do.
So we've got Freud talking about these unresolved issues. We've got Erikson and ego integrity. What other theories are out there?
One of the most interesting ones is called terror management theory. And this theory argues that death anxiety, it's our deepest fear. And that a lot of human behavior, from chasing status to clinging to beliefs, all of it is driven by trying to cope with that fear.
So our achievements, our relationships, even our beliefs, it's all to, feel less insignificant knowing that we're going to die someday. That's a lot.
It is a lot, but it also shows just how resilient humans are. We find ways to create meaning even when faced with the fact that, yeah, we are mortal.
So it's not all doom and gloom then.
No, not at all. Some philosophers like Martin Heidegger, he even saw death anxiety as a path to freedom.
Okay, now that's a new one. How can being afraid of dying lead to freedom?
So Heidegger, he thought that by really facing our mortality, like really embracing the fact that our time here is limited, that could actually free us from the unimportant stuff that tends to consume our lives.
So like living intentionally, knowing that every moment counts. I kind of like that.
Right. And then you have meaning management theory, suggesting that we don't just fear death, we're actively trying to manage that fear. And we do it by finding meaning in life. Relationships, achievements, even our beliefs, they all kind of become ways to feel a sense of purpose.
Building a legacy, something that outlasts us.
Precisely. It's about creating something that gives our lives meaning even after we're gone. It's recognizing that, yeah, death might be unavoidable, but the impact we have can live on.
That's a much more hopeful way to think about it. So there's not one answer for why we fear death. It's kind of a bunch of things woven together. It's almost as complex as, well, being human.
Yeah, you said it. Thanatophobia, it's not one size fits all. It's influenced by your age, gender, religion, the culture you grew up in. All these things come together to make it different for everyone.
Let's break down some of those factors. First up, age and gender. I read somewhere that death anxiety, it might peak when we're in our 20s, and then again, for women specifically, in their 50s. What's that all about?
Yeah, kind of an interesting pattern, isn't it? Research actually suggests that our 20s, they're a time of like heightened self-awareness when we really start to grapple with who am I and where do I fit in?
We're young, we're figuring things out, feeling invincible, and then suddenly we have to deal with the fact that we're not.
It can be a pretty jarring realization, and for women, that second peak around their 50s, it could be a few things. Hormones changing, shifting social roles. It's a time of, like, big life transitions often. Kids moving out, careers changing, parents getting older. And these transitions, they often make us think about our own mortality.
Reaching a crossroads and thinking, what's next? And for some people, that might bring up anxiety about the end of the road.
Exactly. And then you've got religion. For some, it brings comfort when facing death, the promise of an afterlife, or seeing loved ones again.
But for others, it can actually cause more anxiety. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Some religious ideas focus on, like, punishment in the afterlife, which, if you're worried you haven't lived up to certain expectations, that can create a lot of anxiety.
So religion can be a double-edged sword when it comes to death anxiety.
Totally. And of course, we can't forget about culture, right? That plays a huge role in how we view death. Some cultures, they celebrate death as a transition, a new beginning even, while others, they see it as this huge loss, something to be feared. These cultural norms, they really do have a big impact on how we experience these anxieties on an individual level.
It's amazing to me how something is like big and abstract as death, it's still shaped by our own experiences and what we're taught by our families and our cultures. No wonder the thanatophobia is so complex.
And it often doesn't travel alone either. We see it tangled up with other mental health stuff a lot.
That's right. We mentioned that before. What are some of the conditions that we often see alongside the thanatophobia?
Well, like we've been talking about, at its core, it's about anxiety, right? So it's not surprising that thanatophobia often shows up with, like, generalized anxiety disorder, which is where, the worry, it's not just death, it's everything.
So it's that feeling of being constantly on edge, like something bad is always about to happen.
Yeah, you nailed it. And then you've got panic disorder, which is a whole other thing. Those are the sudden, intense waves of fear. They can feel like, honestly, like you're having a heart attack.
I bet those are scary. I've heard they can even make you feel like you're dying in the moment.
That's right. And that feeling of doom, that can be especially rough for someone who's already scared of death. It can turn into this awful cycle.
And I imagine hypochondriasis or illness anxiety disorder, that probably plays into this too, right?
Exactly. That constant worry about having some kind of serious illness, it just feeds right into that fear of dying.
Every ache and pain is like potentially a death sentence.
Yeah.
That must be really hard to deal with.
Absolutely. And it's not just adults who deal with this stuff. Kids have it too,
Really? I mean, kids they're so carefree a lot of the time. At what age does this fear of death even start to show up?
Earlier than you might think, honestly. Research suggests that even kids as young as 5 can experience death anxiety. It's often tied to like their understanding of the world developing and them figuring out that things die, and that includes them too.
How does it show up in kids? Do they actually say they're afraid to die? Or is it different?
Oh, it definitely comes out differently than it does with adults. You might see more tantrums, or they might be more defiant, even physical stuff like stomach aches. You might see them clinging to their parents or their caregivers more, or becoming overly worried about their safety or the safety of people they love.
That makes sense. They don't always have the words for those big feelings yet, so it comes out in other ways.
Right. And sometimes just helping them understand the biological reality of death, like what
Right.
actually happens in an age-appropriate way, of course, but that can actually help to lessen their fear. Knowledge can be really powerful, even when it's about something like death.
So it's more about helping them understand it in a way that they can handle
Yeah,
rather than trying to pretend like death doesn't exist.
exactly. And that actually brings up a really important point about dealing with fear in general, not just in kids. The good news is that thanatophobia, just like other phobias, it can be treated.
Oh, that is good news.
Yeah.
So what are some of the most effective ways to help someone who's struggling with this fear?
One of the most common and the most successful treatments out there is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Have you heard of that?
I have, yeah.
Okay, cool. So CBT is all about helping people learn to identify and change those negative thought patterns that are like fueling their fear of death.
So it's like hitting the reset button on those automatic negative thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. A big part of that reset involves like really challenging those irrational thoughts and then replacing them with more balanced, more realistic ones. For example, someone with thanatophobia, they might have these really like catastrophic thoughts about what it means to die, like always imagining the worst possible scenario. CBT helps them to challenge those assumptions and to consider other, more likely outcomes.
So grounding that fear in reality rather than letting it spiral.
You got it. And another really, really effective approach is exposure therapy. And that involves slowly and safely exposing someone to things that trigger their fear of death.
So like would that be things like going to a funeral or talking about death more openly?
Exactly. The idea is that by confronting their fear little by little in a safe environment, their anxiety will start to decrease.
Like facing your fears head on until they don't have that power over you anymore.
Yeah.
I can see how that would help.
It can be really effective, but it's important to remember that treatment, it's not about making the fear of death disappear completely. Like that's a normal human emotion,
Yeah.
It's more about getting it to a manageable level so it's not controlling your life.
So learning to live with it rather than letting it call the shots.
Exactly. It's about giving people the tools to live their lives to the fullest, without being held back by that fear.
It's about accepting death as a part of life,
Wow.
not something to be afraid of.
Well said.
We've covered so much in this deep dive. We talked about all the different types of death anxiety, the theories behind it, how it affects kids, how it affects adults. It's been a real crash course in the psychology of fear and mortality.
It has. But all this talk about death anxiety, it kind of makes you wonder,
What's that?
what if instead of fearing death, we could actually use it to our advantage?
Use it to our advantage. What do you mean by that?
Well, we both know death is going to happen, right? It's inevitable. It's going to happen to all of us someday. But what if, instead of letting that fact just paralyze us with fear, we used it, What if we used that knowledge as a motivator?
So instead of seeing death as this big scary thing, we see it as a call to action, like a reminder to appreciate each day and really make the most of it.
Exactly. Think about all the energy we spend just trying to ignore death, pretend it's not coming. What if we could lean into that a bit? We might unlock a whole new way of living.
Okay, I like that. But how do we do that? How do we go from being scared of death to really embracing life?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
But some of the stuff we talked about earlier, some of those theories, they actually give us some clues. Remember terror management theory?
Yeah.
It says that a lot of what we do, our achievements, our desire to leave something behind it, all comes from this need to feel like our lives matter, that we'll leave a mark.
So instead of our accomplishments being a way to just distract ourselves from death, they become our legacy, a way to make our mark on the world because we know our time is limited.
Exactly. And those existential philosophers we were talking about, Heidegger, for example, he truly believed that confronting our mortality, really looking it in the eye, it could help us break free from all the unimportant stuff and really focus on what matters.
So it's like death, it becomes this this weird catalyst for living a more authentic life. If we're not constantly running from it, we can actually be present in our lives right now and live in a way that feels true to who we are.
It's a big shift in thinking. Death goes from being this scary thing in the future to being an opportunity to live more deliberately, more intentionally, right here, right now.
It really makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, facing our mortality is the key to living a better life.
It's a question worth asking ourselves, for sure.
It really is.
Yeah.
It makes me think about what we were saying about kids and death anxiety. We were talking about how, we shouldn't try to shield them from it, but help them understand it. Maybe adults need to do that for themselves, too.
Yeah. To build a healthier relationship with death. To see it not as something to be afraid of, but as just, as a natural part of life.
Exactly. So, to our listeners, we want to leave you with this. What if you tried embracing your own mortality? Not with fear, but with, maybe a sense of curiosity. Think about it. How could that change the way you live your life, your priorities, your relationships? How would it change your experience of each day?
This has been a deep dive into death anxiety, for sure. But the biggest takeaway here might just be this. Even within that fear, within that knowledge that our time here is limited, there's this incredible opportunity for growth. We can use it to live a more meaningful life.
So true. And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.